Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the Medical Center Hour, which today also doubles as Department of Medicine Grand Rounds. I'm Marcia Day-Childress from the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities, and our organization produces these weekly Medical Center Hour programs. This is the first of the spring 2018 semester, and we'll look forward to having you join us. Okay, along with the house mice, or whatever that is. As I said, this Medical Center Hour is a joint enterprise with the Department of Medicine. It's a partnering that we do occasionally when we share interests in a topic or speaker. But today's partnership is a first. It's the inaugural Edward W. Hook Lecture in Medicine and the Arts. This Hook Lecture remembers UVA's late chair of internal medicine. He was chief of medicine for 21 years and founding director of the School of Medicine's program of Humanities in Medicine, now part of the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities. And while Dr. Hook was internationally known as an infectious disease specialist and similarly distinguished as a president and master of the American College of Physicians, he was also a lifelong connoisseur of the arts. He saw and celebrated the ways art could tutor the doctor, giving her or him valuable practice in the core clinical skills of curiosity, attention, interpretation, communication, compassion, openness to the other, and tolerance of ambiguity and uncertainty. Made possible through funds Dr. Hook set aside decades ago for the purchase of art, the Hook Lecture in Medicine and the Arts enables us now to introduce into physician education and training a practicing artist whose work enacts and sets abuzz the medicine-art connection. This first Hook Lecture offers a dual perspective. Our guest, Bill Hayes, is here as an accomplished writer and photographer, as demonstrated by his three most recent and critically acclaimed books, The Anatomist, Insomniac City, and How New York Breaks Your Heart. But he also brings us a rich view of a celebrated physician who was both a devotee and a practitioner of the arts, neurologist and writer Oliver Sacks. Sacks, who died in August 2016, was a legend in his own time for the ways in which his work spanned and probed medicine, science, and the arts. He was a tireless explorer of both the natural world and the human condition. His creative nature and prodigious output enriched medicine and culture alike. His clinical tales, published in both the medical and popular literature, continue to intrigue and enthrall a wide audience. These tales stretch the traditional case history so as to illuminate and celebrate the person who is marked and often rendered remarkable by neuropsychological illness. Beneath every story flares Sacks' own curiosity, an insatiable urge to question, and a generous capacity for paying meticulous attention. Bill Hayes was Oliver Sacks' friend and late life partner. His talk for us addresses the place of curiosity and creativity in Oliver Sacks' practice, but also in his own, and illuminates especially how, for both men, interest in and radical openness to a fellow human being are paramount. I will quickly mention Bill Hayes disclosed no financial conflicts of interest. We'll also mention the UVA bookstore is outside with a sampling of books from both Sacks and Hayes. And to start, we're going to open with a very brief video introduction and obituary for Oliver Sacks. And following this, you'll meet Bill Hayes.
Special thank you to Marcia Childress and to the Center for Ethics and Humanities, all of you. It's really an honor to be giving the inaugural Hooker Lecture. I'm going to be talking about a number of different things today, including my recent book, the memoir Insomniac City, my forthcoming book, which is coming in a couple of weeks, a book of photography called How New York Breaks Your Heart. But first, I'm going to say a few words about the man commemorated in that video, my late partner, Oliver Sacks, author and neurologist. Oliver and I met in the most old-fashioned way. He wrote me a letter. This was 10 years ago. I was living in San Francisco in 2008, and I had recently published a book called The Anatomist, which tells the story behind the classic 19th century text, Gray's Anatomy. It's a narrative nonfiction account of Henry Gray and the illustrator Henry Carter. So one day I get a letter out of the blue, return address, Oliver Sacks, New York, New York. I was very surprised. He wrote to say, "Dear Mr. Hayes, I enjoyed your book very much." And he described that he'd grown up in a family of doctors. Both of his parents were physicians, and there was always a copy of Gray's Anatomy in the house. So he's happy to know something about the history of Henry Gray and Henry Carter. So what would you do if you got a letter from Oliver Sacks? I wrote a letter back right away, and to my surprise, he wrote a letter back to me. And a kind of correspondence ensued, somewhat formal, but always friendly. And fast forward to about a year after I got the first letter, to spring of 2009, and I moved to New York City from San Francisco, where I lived for about 25 years. Moving there had nothing to do with Oliver Sacks, but once I got there, I also lived in the West Village. We became very close and fell in love, and we were a couple until his death in August 2015. We were together for about 6 years. Given the opportunity to talk to you today, I thought I'd say a few words about his entire body of work, how it evolved over the 45 years of his publishing, and something about the legacy he left us. Before I'd gotten the letter from Oliver, I'd read 2 of his books. I had just read Uncle Tungsten, his memoir, and I'd read Musical Ophelia. But then, of course, once we were together, I read everything, all of his books and essays and forewords and reviews and journal pieces. So I have a good sense of the work. I don't pretend to be objective or a critic, but hopefully I can offer some personal insights. He published 13 books in his lifetime, and since his death, we've published an additional 2. So there are 15 books over a period of about 45 to 50 years. With a major artist like Oliver Sacks, one can often identify early, middle, and late periods to his work, and I think that's true of Oliver as well. But I also see common threads within each of those periods, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. The first period I call In the Clinic. These all date from 1970 to 1985. They all contain medical case histories. A classic form that you all know can be traced back to Hippocrates. Hippocrates, who recognized that disease or illness or injury follows a course from the patient's initial report of symptoms to its resolution, whether it's a happy resolution or a fatal resolution, and that there's a kind of narrative arc to illness and disease and injury. Oliver really took this form of the case history to a new level of literary art and popularity with his singular intellectual fire, his wide-ranging references, his great humanity, and not least his gift for storytelling and his sometimes eccentric writing style. There's a kind of mythological or fable-like quality to many of the stories in these early books. He's describing people with highly unusual conditions, often puzzling losses of one kind or another, sometimes excesses or gains, but surviving at great odds, even thriving. This early work is deeply informed by his reading in philosophy, 19th century natural histories, medical history, Freud, another master of the case history, Oliver's own experience in psychoanalysis. He was in psychoanalysis, Freudian analysis for 40 years. And not least, the stories of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes stories. He loved those stories, and some of his case histories start with a kind of Sherlock Holmes trope. A letter that arrives out of the blue, or a knock at the door, or a phone call. All driven by Oliver's intense curiosity. The second or middle period of his work, dating 1990 to 2002, I put in the category of journeys. Literally and metaphorically, after the man who mistook his wife for a hat, which I will talk about a little more in a moment, Oliver was able, literally and metaphorically, to take off his white coat and leave behind the hospitals and clinics where he'd worked for a couple of decades and kind of go on the road. He visited the South and Gallaudet University. He went to islands in the South Pacific. He went to Oaxaca, Mexico. He took a kind of metaphorical journey back in time, 60 years, to write his memoir, Uncle Tungsten. But probably most important about this period, as I said, he left the hospitals and clinics behind and met people in the cities and in the homes where they lived and at the jobs where they worked, and profiled them in the book An Anthropologist on Mars, seeing a kind of social context. To me, this period is marked by Oliver being a little bit less the doctor and definitely more the writer, though he was obviously also both. For the third period, I'm paraphrasing the title of his now classic essay from the last year of his life, My Own Life, and calling it His Own Life. By this point, he was in his early 70s, retired from medical practice, and quietly and prolifically turning out one book after another, each increasingly more and more personal in tone and subject matter, revealing perhaps an even more complex human being than we knew. So if you look at this list of books, there are 15 here. I think what's striking is the range, the wide range of books and subject matter. Case histories, travel chronicles, memoirs. I'm going to say a few words about each book. Migraine, his first, published at age 37, marked the beginning of his publishing career, but also the end of a troubled 4-year period. He'd been addicted to amphetamines, something that started in Los Angeles at UCLA when he was a resident. And in the middle of that, he moved to New York and took another post and realized finally that he needed to stop or he was going to die. And he quit cold turkey, at the same time determined to write this book he had in his head. Migraine is all on the single topic of migraine, a condition he knew well. He'd suffered from migraine since he was a little boy, and he'd also worked in a headache clinic in the Bronx. So the stories and case histories were drawn from those experiences. Migraine is probably the most formal of any of his books. It's very densely packed with information. Awakenings, as you saw in that video, and maybe some of you have seen the film, recounts the rather dramatic story of a group of patients, victims of the encephalitis lethargica epidemic of the early 20th century, who'd been sort of left in a chronic disease hospital where he worked, and rendered nearly lifeless by this illness. Oliver encountered these patients and treated them with the drug L-Dopa, which essentially awakened them from this decades-long sleep, although only temporarily. You'll notice if you look at this list that the biggest gap in between books is between Awakenings and A Leg to Stand On. There are 11 years there. That's not because Awakenings was a great success. In fact, it wasn't at the time. It wasn't a bestseller or well-known until the film came out in 1990. This category, In the Clinic, this is the one book where Oliver is not the doctor, but he is himself the patient. He'd had kind of a freak accident. He was hiking in Norway and fell and tore all the quadriceps muscles, tendons from one leg. And he was by himself and actually thought he was going to die on that mountain because he couldn't walk back down. But he was rescued. and in the hospital for a couple of weeks and then recovering for several weeks. And he had a very strange phenomenon, like one that would, one of his patients might have had, a kind of disorder of body image, where the leg, the injured leg, became almost like an alien part of his body, almost like a phantom limb. Recounting this story in narrative proved to be very difficult for him. He sometimes referred to that 11-year period as being blocked. But for Oliver Sacks, to be blocked is the opposite of what it would be for me, which would be not to write, or not to be able to write. For him, it was just an excess, an effusion. And he wrote draft after draft after draft of this book, not quite able to perfect it. And friends and family and his editor encouraged him to give up on it, but he didn't. And I think one of the most important things that came out of that is, finally, when that albatross was lifted, there was a great release. And you'll see that only a year later came The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. It was as if a kind of floodgate was open, door opened. He had to finish the legbook before he moved on to Hat. Hat is composed of 24 case histories. Some of them are quite short. They deal, as I said before, with often puzzling losses, sometimes excesses. But they're concerned more philosophically with the construction of identity, construction of the self, or often the reconstruction of identity or the self. In fact, Oliver coined the term existential neurology to describe what he felt he was investigating and bringing to light. This book became an international bestseller, much to the very shy Oliver Sacks' surprise, and partly helped, I'm sure, by the title, which is so memorable. But he had no idea that it would become such a success. He really became a public figure and was largely lauded and applauded for his humane portraits of people with different neurological disorders. But he was criticized too. There were some who felt that he may have exploited his patients in service to his literary career. Others felt there was too much focus on the bizarre, on freakish conditions. He very soundly rejected that criticism. He did get consent from these patients to share their stories, and he did change identifying details to protect their privacy. And as for the charge that he was only focused on the bizarre, he sort of turned that around, and he would say he felt he was presenting extremes, or what he called exemplars. And within these exemplars of the human condition, one could identify universal truths that we all share. Seeing Voices, the first book in this second period, is interesting to look at. After the great success of Hat and the criticism, there was a kind of retreat or retrenching. And he stepped back and he plunged into a world and a subject matter and a culture he knew nothing about. In fact, in the introduction to Seeing Voices, he says, "I am an outsider here." This is a book about the deaf, the culture and community and history of the deaf and sign language. But Oliver being Oliver, it became much more than that. It's also about language generally, and the acquisition of language, and linguistics, and child development, another area he'd never really touched on before. An Anthropologist on Mars follows. This is in some ways comparable to Hat, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, but very different stylistically. Anthropologist is composed of just 7 case histories instead of 24. They're much more detailed narratives. And more importantly, these are stories where he met people where they lived and worked, the cities they lived in. So seeing them in their social contexts, meeting Temple Grandin, a woman with autism, at her home in Colorado, and where she worked, designing machinery for cattle. And there's a story of a surgeon with Tourette syndrome, and someone who's able to function well within his life and even to operate, although he does have severe Tourette's, but in the moments when he's operating, it seems to disappear. Oliver is often credited with being sort of, not the father, but a person who contributed very much to this idea of neurodiversity. And I think a lot of that does rest on this book, An Anthropologist on Mars. Many of the profiles first appeared in the New Yorker. There was a sense of just normalizing differences. And that wasn't a term he invented himself, but one that came to be associated with him. The Island of the Colorblind is one that not that many people know about, perhaps. It's definitely the most lushly lyrical of all of his books. He was a beautiful writer, and he was able in this book to really indulge in that. But it's very interesting on its own terms as well. In this book, he combines three genres, really. There are medical case histories. There's also a kind of detective story. He's tracking down two different diseases or disorders, congenital colorblindness on one island in the South Pacific, and a degenerative neurological disease, somewhat like Parkinson's, as I understand it, on another island. And in addition, it's just purely a travel chronicle. He loved botany. He was very taken by the flora and fauna on these islands. So he goes off on sort of literary excursions about the flora and fauna of these islands. Though Oliver Sacks is without a doubt present in all of his books, his voice, his presence is in all of his books. His memoir, Uncle Tungsten, was something quite different. Went back in time 60 years and recounted his boyhood in London during the Second World War, and when he and his brother Michael were sent to a boarding school for their own safety outside of London, while his parents, both doctors, had to stay in London and work. It also recounts his boyhood love of chemistry. He absolutely fell in love with chemistry, with the periodic table, with the elements, and he recounts that in this book. Oaxaca Journal is exactly what the title suggests. It's a journal written on a trip to Oaxaca, Mexico. He went there with a group of fellow fern lovers. Oliver was, until the end of his life, a proud member of the American Fern Society, which was made up of amateur botanists and fern lovers, but also experts in the field. And so they went on fern expeditions. He didn't go there thinking he would write a book, but he kept such a detailed journal, full of detail not only about the ferns and the travels, but about everything he saw, that he published it as a book. With music Ophelia, he returns to writing case histories, but unlike Seen Voices, where he was dealing with language, something he hadn't really known a lot about, or the deaf, music was something he was passionate about and very knowledgeable about. He played the piano since he was young. He knew music history, and he was really sort of a trailblazer in using music therapy in his practice, going back to the Awakenings patients. This book is a little different, though, in that it relies more on his correspondence. Turns out Bill Hayes wasn't the only person he was writing to. He had a huge correspondence with people who would write to him from all over the world, whether with questions about their own condition or a family member's condition, or just telling them their stories. So in Music Ophelia, many of the stories in there originated with some of those correspondence. The Mind's Eye really focuses on the subject of visual perception, which is one of Oliver's interests throughout his life. It was triggered by a personal event, his bout with cancer. I think it was 2005 or 2006. He was found to have a melanoma on his optic nerve. And the treatment for that left him blind in one eye. And Oliver, being Oliver, rather than just despairing, it caused him to think and read and question and wonder even more about visual perception. So while he does write about his own experience with cancer and losing sight in one eye and being one-eyed, He also writes about a woman with a loss of stereo vision, someone who loses the ability to read, and he writes about his own neurological disorder, or difference really, prosopagnosia, which, as many of you probably know, means essentially face blindness. Oliver had difficulty recognizing faces, and this is something I figured out even before he explained it to me, because he could never recognize our neighbors in our building, whereas I could recognize someone and know their name. For him, it was often as if it was the first time he was seeing them. So he wrote about prosopagnosia. Hallucinations was originally a chapter in The Mind's Eye dealing with visual hallucinations, but he found the subject too vast and too interesting, and the literature on it too small at that point, that he decided he wanted to write a whole book on hallucinations. So this is not only about visual hallucinations, but also audio hallucinations, hallucinations of all the senses and from all different disorders and diseases and conditions, except, importantly, for schizophrenia and mental illness. That was a portion he deliberately left out, feeling that was too large a subject to take on for this book. On the Move, his autobiography picks up where Uncle Tungsten left off and recounts the story of his young adulthood and his remarkable career. It was an important book because he writes for the very first time in his life about his private life. Oliver had been a public figure since the 80s and was often asked and questioned about his private life, and he never spoke about it or wrote about it, preferring to keep that private. But here he did write about his sexuality, about being gay, about early romances and heartbreaks. This is not the subject of the whole book, but he did write about it and about our relationship as well. Oliver finished On the Move, the manuscript, in December 2014, around Christmas time. And there was a great feeling of relief to get this sort of off his shoulders, something he'd been carrying around privately for so long. And it was a bitter irony that about a month later he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. I remember so well that one of the first calls he made after getting the prognosis in the car on the way from the doctors after getting this diagnosis was to his publisher, asking if they could move the publication date up. It was scheduled to be published about a year later, so let's say fall or winter of 2015. But they had told him he had 6 to 18 months to live. I, of course, was hoping it was 18, but somehow in his gut he knew he had less time. And they did indeed move mountains and publish the book in the spring, so he was able to see it published. I remember wondering if he would go back to the manuscript and write a kind of epilogue or final chapter about getting this cancer diagnosis, and he was very clear that, no, that book was finished, that he was done. And literally, while he was proofing the galleys for On the Move, he was working on the first essay that would appear in the New York Times called My Own Life. In this, as many of you know, he announced to the world that he'd been diagnosed with terminal metastatic cancer. He went on to write a number of pieces that year. It was an incredibly prolific year for him, and as it happens for me as a photographer. He wrote 2 more pieces, well, actually 3 more pieces for the New York Times, but 2 addressing his illness, My Periodic Table, and a beautiful piece called Sabbath, which was published just 2 weeks before his death, in which he kind of recapitulates his whole biography and coming to terms with his life, but in the space of just 1,000 words. It's an incredible essay in terms of just compression. He wrote other pieces that year as well, a major case history for the New Yorker, pieces for the New York Review of Books. Shortly after his death, we published the 3 New York Times essays in a little book called Gratitude, beautiful little book. And then just this last fall, we brought out a book that Oliver was working on up until just 2 weeks before he died, called The River of Consciousness. And The River of Consciousness is again, slightly different from anything he'd done before. These are essays devoted to the history of science. He writes about Charles Darwin, his great hero, William James, another great hero, Freud, also on concepts like time, memory, and consciousness. So that gives you a sense of Oliver Sacks, the author. But since you have me, I want to tell you a little bit about Oliver Sacks, the man, on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to read to you a little piece, it's quite short, that I wrote for a tribute to Oliver when we launched the River of Consciousness in New York in the fall. And this is called The Man Who Loved Words. Among many other things, Oliver Sacks was a man of multiple enthusiasms for ferns, cycads, cephalopods, minerals, metals, motorbikes, swimming, smoked salmon, French herring, and Bach, to name a few, but none more so than for words. When I say Oliver loved words, I don't simply mean within the context of being a writer of numerous now classic books. Even if he had never written a single one, I'm sure Oliver would still have been that funny fellow who took giant dictionaries to bed for light reading, aided by a magnifying glass. He delighted in etymology, synonyms, antonyms, slang, swear words, palindromes, anatomical terms, neologisms, but objected in principle to contractions. He could joyfully parse the difference between homonyms and homophones, not to mention homographs, in dinner table conversation. He also relished saying those three words aloud, that breathy H alliteration. "Every day a word surprises me," he once commented, beaming, apropos of nothing other than that a word had suddenly popped into his head. I used to call Oliver a walking OED, Oxford English Dictionary, because he could recall spellings and definitions so accurately. And yet he remained modest, never flaunting his extraordinary vocabulary, and always deferring to a dictionary for confirmation if in doubt. Oliver loved words so much, he often dreamed of them, and he sometimes even dreamed them up. One morning, 5 years ago, I found a phrase he'd written on the dry erase whiteboard in our kitchen. And all it said was, 5 a.m., Nephilim Xia. "What the hell does that mean?" I said to him while making coffee. Oliver chuckled, then went on to describe an elaborate dream he'd had that night in which he was stuck on an alien planet where anthropomorphic clouds turned menacing and murderously tipped over the Land Rover he was driving. "A cloud nightmare," he added, as if it were hardly his first. He'd written the note upon waking at 5 a.m. so as not to forget it, which was not unusual. He reported his dreams to the Freudian psychoanalyst he saw twice a week. Nephilim Xia, he told me, either means seeing clouds or being enveloped by clouds. But then his brow furrowed. He wasn't so sure. "Let's look it up in the good book," he said. And together we proceeded straight to the OED. So there we found variations on nephology, which means the study of clouds, but no Nephilim Xia. It turns out he'd accidentally coined the word in his half-sleep. We laughed about this, but in fact it was not the first time. Oliver had made up the term musicophilia, the title for his 2007 book, meaning an intense love of music, which hadn't existed before he came up with it. But he was always quick to point out that musicophobia, a hatred of music, had long been part of the English language. He felt that musicophobia appreciated his invention. "Now it has an antonym," he observed. It was this love of words and of the act of writing, which he considered a form of thinking, that moved Oliver to tell me one day shortly after I moved to New York in spring of 2009, "You must keep a journal, Billy." It was not a suggestion, but an instruction. So I thought, I guess I must. And I followed his advice and wrote down that instruction on a little scrap of paper, which I still have to this day. It just says, O says I must keep a journal, May 9th, 2009. My New York journal grew and grew and grew over the years, as the years passed, to 750 pages, but I never reread it until the time came when I decided to write a memoir about my life in New York and my life with Oliver, which I later titled Insomniac City. I thought rereading it would just jog my memory and I'd write a sort of traditional narrative nonfiction memoir. But instead I found something truly surprising. Parts of the book had already been written, in a sense. Scenes and stretches of dialogue between Oliver and me that I'd written down, as if they'd quietly been waiting for me to hear them again. I'm going to give you some examples. August 17th, 2010. I stopped by Oliver's to bring him an ice cream bar. I mentioned I saw fireflies in Abingdon Square Park. Fireflies? Did you keep your mouth shut, Billy? He says. What do you mean keep my mouth shut? They say 3 will kill you. Luciferae, dangerous stuff. I am laughing, but he is not. I really cannot tell if he's serious. I don't want you to die of fireflies, he says. A luminous death. January 1st, 2012. Just before midnight, I taught Oliver how to open a bottle of champagne, something he had never done before in his whole life. So sweet to see the joy and surprise and fear on his face as pop, the cork exploded. He had insisted on wearing his swimming goggles, though, just in case. Okay, welcome to dinner. April 17th, 2012, a not untypical dinner. Oliver snipped the ends off the string beans with his cuticle scissors, quaffing them for the steam. I trimmed the broccoli. We shared a gigantic carrot, passing it back and forth between us while having some of Oliver's specially mixed tea, a blend of smoky Lapsang Souchong and brisk Darjeeling. We left the salmon to marinate. I read the paper. Oliver went into the bedroom and did 55 of his signature crunches or sit-ups, exhaling on the first, then holding it 5 seconds on the second. Oliver likes things to be in 5s. I grilled the salmon atop the stove, 5 minutes each side, and made some toast from leftover challah bread. I opened a bottle of wine. I was feeling blue. I don't know why. To divert me, cheer me, Oliver told me a story of a Tourette's patient who was a surgeon and who would smoke while he was exercising every morning. This made me laugh. I hadn't heard it before. So after eating, Oliver got up and found this story in An Anthropologist on Mars, his large print edition. As I lay on the couch, he sat at the table and read the entire story from start to finish in the most animated voice, lavishly drawing out the more unusual words. I peeked over the couch a few times to watch him reading the book just a couple of inches from his face. It's amazing he can read it all. He's so nearly completely blind. I clapped when he came to the end. We returned to the kitchen. His wine was too sour, so he added a packet of artificial sweetener to it. True. Much better, he said, and drank it down. We talked about this and that, and then I said I needed to go to bed. He absentmindedly reached for the bottle of port uncorked it, and took a swig. Nothing like port, he murmured. Next morning, Oliver reported that he had had a dream in which he was at a, quote, charming little cafe in the shadow of two giant oversized mushrooms. On the menu, 2 kinds of fern salad, of course, and a carrot salad with 7,217 different carrots. He had drawn the number and a picture of the mushroom cafe on the kitchen whiteboard when he woke in the middle of the night. In my book, Insomniac City, I weave together these notes from the journal with vignettes, scenes and stories from my life in New York, as well as about 40 photographs that I took on the streets of New York. And it goes back and forth between street life, crowded, crazy life in New York, bumping into strangers, and then life in our apartment, which was a kind of cocoon of conversation and music, and if you can believe this, no technology. Oliver did not own a computer, never used one, or a smartphone. There was no Wi-Fi in the apartment, so it was a quiet, protected space. We also sometimes had great conversations in the car. September 20th, 2014. Do you sometimes catch yourself thinking, says O, out of the blue, in the car, on the way to his weekend home in the Hudson Valley. I sometimes sort of feel like I'm looking at the neural basis of consciousness, he says. I look at him. You do? Yes. Those are special occasions, he went on, when the mind takes off and you can watch it. It's largely autonomous, but autonomous on your behalf, in regard to problems, questions, and so on. He paused, then returned to his thought. These are creative flights. Flights. Nice word, flights. Yeah, I love that word, I said. Oliver, what triggers such flights for you? Surprise, astonishment, wonder. Oliver did not live to see me complete Insomniac City, but I'm sure he would not have been surprised that its genesis started in a journal, because so many of his own books and writings started in his journals. There are something like 800 in his archive, which someday we will go through and hopefully do a publication, selected entries from the journals of Oliver Sacks. The new book, The River of Consciousness, is no different. Some of these pieces started with journal entries. And I'm just going to read a very brief passage, which I think is quite beautiful, from the title essay, The River of Consciousness, in which he really takes on one of the big questions of neuroscience. What is consciousness? What is the basis of consciousness? How does one describe it? And here, in a very kind of personal passage, so imagine Oliver Sacks sitting on 7th Avenue with his journal out as he writes. As I write, I'm sitting at a cafe on 7th Avenue, watching the world go by. My attention and focus dart to and fro. A girl in a red dress. The sun, at last, emerging from the clouds. A man walking a funny dog. But there are also other sensations that seem to come by themselves. The noise of a car backfiring, the smell of a cigarette smoke as an upwind neighbor lights up. These are all events which catch my attention for a moment as they happen. Why? Why, out of 1,000 possible perceptions, are these the ones I seize upon? Reflections, memories, associations lie behind them. For consciousness is always active and selective, charged with feelings and meanings uniquely our own, informing our choices and interfusing our perceptions. So it's not just 7th Avenue that I see, but my 7th Avenue, marked by my own selfhood and identity. Christopher Isherwood starts his story, A Berlin Diary, with an extended photographic metaphor. I am a camera, with its shutter open, quite passive, recording, not thinking, Isherwood writes. Oliver goes on. But we deceive ourselves if we imagine that we can ever be passive, impartial observers. Every perception, every scene is shaped by us, whether we intend it, or know it, or not. We are the directors of the film we are making, but we are its subjects too. Every frame, every moment is us, is ours. I mentioned I have a new book coming out in about 2 weeks, the day before Valentine's Day. It's called How New York Breaks Your Heart, and here's a quick preview of the photos in this book. It's all street photography, 150 photographs, black and white and color, taken since I moved to New York in 2009. My operating method in doing street photography is always to ask permission of the person I'm photographing. So there's a kind of instantaneous intimacy in the moment of taking the picture when they work. And as you watch these, I'm just going to read a little passage from Insomniac City about being a New Yorker. I had visited New York many times over the years, but living here, as I soon discovered, is a whole different ballgame. On the other hand, one doesn't become a New Yorker by virtue of having a New York address. For me, the moment came the first time I left the city. I flew back to Seattle for Christmas to see family. No sooner had the plane lifted off than I felt a pang of regret. To be a New Yorker is to be away from the city and feel like you're missing something, I wrote on a cocktail napkin. By this, I didn't mean missing the Rockettes at Radio City or New Year's Eve in Times Square or some amazing exhibition at the Met. In New York, there's always something amazing happening somewhere that you end up hearing about only later. What I meant instead was missing the evanescent, the eavesdropped, the unexpected. A snowfall that blankets the city and turns it into a peaceful new world. Or in summer, the sight of the first fireflies in the park at twilight. The clop-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones in the West Village, mounted police patrolling late at night. Or a lover's quarrel within earshot of all passers-by. Of course, what is music to my ears may be intolerable to another's. Life here is a John Cage score, dissonance made eloquent. Thank you all very much. To take any questions. I think Matt's going to help me out.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. That was an outstanding talk. That's a quick question about the dictionaries. Did Oliver Sacks ever say you must read the dictionary, or how was his approach? Where you start from A and go to Z? Was there a letter of the day, or
a word would come to him that would lead him to a dictionary. That would often not be good enough, and so he'd want to look in another dictionary. One of his favorites was one given to him by a favorite aunt when he was a little boy. It's still published. It's called Chambers' Dictionary of the English Language. It's a little bit quirkier than most dictionaries. It's very English. So actually, usually Chambers was first, and then moving on to the OED and on. But yeah, you couldn't quite understand why I wouldn't join him in bringing dictionaries to bed. I didn't have that same love. Yes?
You mentioned that
if you don't mind using the mic?
you mentioned that his last book, he didn't want to write the epilogue after his diagnosis or his prognosis was established because he felt like the book was finished. But as his writing style evolved over a couple of decades, did he ever express any sentiment about how he would have maybe rewritten something like Migraines, which is maybe more formal in its early stage. Did he ever sort of talk about revisiting his early works?
Well, that's a great question, and you'll find if you look at copies of the early books, like Migraine, Awakenings, and A Leg to Stand On in particular, I think Awakenings has 2, if not 3, later introductions, so he kept adding to it, new thoughts. A Leg to Stand On has an additional afterword. He added footnotes. To, I think, Island of the Colorblind, he later added endnotes. So he was a kind of inveterate tinkerer early in his life, known to be indecisive, but also so intensely curious. He was continually learning new things that he wanted to add. By the time I met him, he'd sort of definitely settled into a much more mature and composed phase. There are fewer footnotes in the later books. There's a different feeling of authority, a different narrative fluidity, I think, but every book has its charms.
Yeah, at the end of Uncle Tungsten, he was sort of whipped out of chemistry by his parents. And I wondered if he ever regretted that transfer.
Did you regret not going into chemistry? Yes, very, very much. It was kind of preordained that he would become a doctor. Both of his parents were doctors. His 2 eldest brothers were doctors. It was just kind of expected. He didn't particularly want to be a doctor. He wanted to be a chemist or a botanist. Those were his greatest, deepest loves. And the truth is, he struggled in medical school. Probably partly because he wasn't too in love with it. He wasn't a great test taker. But all of that changed on the day that he first began seeing patients. And he has written about the fact that that's when it all came together for him. And I think after that, he never really looked back. He also felt in later years that he really didn't have quite the brilliance to be a great chemist or a great mathematician, which is what he would also have loved to be. So he found his calling. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you talk about your interactions when you approach someone to ask when you can take their photo in New York?
Sure. Yeah, I get asked about this a lot. From the very beginning, I have always approached the person and asked permission. I just feel it's respectful. I wouldn't want someone taking my picture without my knowing. It creates a different kind of photography. Oftentimes, if this makes sense, I see the picture composed even before I see the person. Often in New York, it's as if the picture's just waiting there for me to take it. A person leaning in a doorway, or a guy sitting on the back of his truck, or 2 movers playing cards in the back of their truck, and I come upon it and just think, oh my God, it's amazing. But I say, I'm a photographer, can I take your picture? I try to say it fast so that the scene doesn't change. One of the last pictures you saw there was a guy in a red suit walking down the sidewalk, kicking up his legs. I saw him coming toward me, and I just yelled out, like, hey, I'm a photographer, can I take your picture? And he's like, sure. And I took it, and he just kept going. And sometimes it is that way.
Do you get no's?
Say again?
Do you get no?
Oh, I get lots of no's. I don't know what the percentage is. It's at least 50-50. And I understand that. A stranger coming up to you. It's definitely, I have to be honest, it's a little bit easier to shoot men than women. Women more often say no. But I've learned that if people say no, it's very instinctive. It's either yes or no. And if they say no, I just thank them and walk on. Yeah. Yes?
Can you talk about what it was like to have your partner publish your relationship in a book, and just that vulnerability and having your personal life become public?
Well, it was, first of all, you mean Oliver in On the Move. It was absolutely entirely his own decision, something that he came to very gradually, slowly over the years. Testing the waters first by just writing chapters and scenes and thinking, maybe I won't publish them, maybe they'll just go into my archive. But by the time he really zeroed in on the manuscript, he was ready. He didn't show me that chapter about the two of us until it was done, and I thought it was absolutely beautiful, discreet, and honest. And I mean, the oddest thing about it was that our relationship was so private that many people close to us didn't even know about the nature of our relationship, or didn't quite understand it, because neither of us ever talked about it or wrote about it. But that changed with On the Move. So there was only a brief window where that was really public. And he encouraged me to write about us as freely as I would like. Question?
We have time maybe for one more question.
Yep.
I know that everything came together for him when he met his patients as a provider, and that really solidified who he was and what he wanted to do. But did he ever talk about the relationships with his colleagues, like the nurses and the students that he trained, and how that changed him? Or
Yeah, she asked about, he wrote and talked about his relationships with his patients, but what about his relationships with his colleagues? Definitely the nurses at Beth Abraham were very important to helping Dr. Sacks keep his life together and write and his practice. He had a very special relationship with one named Connie Tomeo, who was the music therapist, who helped with the Awakenings patients. He adored teaching and being with students, but his methods were pretty unconventional. So he didn't have long teaching posts. He was honestly, this is the truth, more likely to take the students, his students, neurology students, residents, to the New York Botanical Garden and go on a walk and sit in the garden and talk. And I've met, former students since then. He said, yeah, Dr. Sacks was the most amazing teacher I've ever had. We would talk about philosophy, and when we talk about practice, but philosophy, religion, anyway, so that his references were very wide-ranging, and he was a great listener. As have been all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.